What is a perfect square trinomial and how can we make one? Let's find out. So we're going to use the process of completing the square to add a term to the expression x squared plus bx. So when we call it completing the square, it's because we are actually completing an actual square, and that's what we see right here in this diagram. We're going to fill this in just a second. So if we're starting with x squared plus bx, we could start with this diagram right here at the bottom left, and we have x times x, which would be x squared, and b times x, which would be bx, right? So there's our x squared plus bx. So if we wanted to go from this smaller rectangle shape to actually a square and complete the square, let's think about what could we do to our b term to split it up? Well, we could divide it by 2, right? And so that's what we see right here. So instead of having b, we're going to have b divided by 2, because essentially that's still us having b, right? We take those two and put them back together, and it would still be the b term. So now we can fill out our table. We have x squared, we have b divided by 2x, b divided by 2x, and now we have b divided by 2 squared. And so this last box that we see right here, this is what we're going to add to our expression x squared plus bx, right? Because b over 2x plus b over 2x, that's just going to get us back to bx, right? And so we have x squared plus bx, and now we have our third term, which in this case we're going to call c, that we should add to our expression. So x squared plus bx plus c. So let's take a look at 3 examples where we find the value of c. So for number 1, we have x squared plus 40x plus c. So we see that b is 40. So we're going to take 40, we're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it. And so 40 divided by 2 would be 20, and 20 squared would be 400. So now we know that c is 400, so we could write this as x squared plus 40x plus 400, and that would be our perfect square trinomial. And so now once we do this, we can also factor this as the square of a binomial. So we have x, and then we have plus, the sign there is whatever sign of b. So since we had positive 40, we have a plus, and then we're going to square this. Now, the value that we put in there that we're adding to x is what we got before we squared. So we did b divided by 2 squared. So just b divided by 2 is going to go in here, and that was 20. So we have our perfect square trinomial, which is x squared plus 40x plus 40, and that would factor as x plus 20 quantity squared. Now let's look at number 2. X squared minus 2x plus c. So we see that b is negative 2, so we could do negative 2 divided by 2 and square that. This would be negative 1 squared, which is equal to 1. So now we have our perfect square trinomial of x squared minus 2x plus 1. And now we could write that in factored form as x. Now b is negative, so x minus. And what did we get when we subtracted? We got a 1, right? Or not when we subtracted, but when we divided by 2, right, before we squared. So we have x minus 1 would be our factored form square of a binomial. Now for number 3, it's going to be a little bit more tricky, and this is when we're going to kind of figure out when it's going to be most efficient for us to use completing the square, and that's when b is an even number, because what do we do to b to complete the square? We divide it by 2. Now, does that mean we can't do it when b is odd? No, it just means we're going to have a fraction. So here, notice that b is negative 9, so we would do negative 9 divided by 2, and we would square that. Now, I would leave that just as a fraction, and I would square the top and the bottom to get 81 over 4. Okay, and so now that's what c is going to be equal to. And so now we have x squared minus 9x plus 81 over 4. And that is a perfect square trinomial. And so now we could factor that as x minus 9 over 2 quantity squared. Okay, and so that's what a perfect square trinomial is, and how we can make one by using the process of completing the square.